everyone, welcome back. Today I'm excited to present a few examples of my 5-sentence structure for plotting. Once again, if you haven't seen that video, I'll link to it down below, but I basically work off of a 5-sentence structure because I'm not a pantser and I'm not a plotter. I'm kind of right in the middle. So using this 5-sentence structure to help plot my novels really keeps me on track. And then I end up tying word counts to them and figuring out a percentage of how far into the novel events need to happen in order to keep everything focused. I had a request to break this down into common examples, so I went ahead and pulled out a couple different books from my bookshelf, and I'm excited to kind of break these down for you. I use word counts for my personal pacing method. I didn't have word counts for some of these novels, so I actually went by page number. So I tell you guys every page number based on how much it is, and then I calculate a percentage by dividing those two page numbers together. So just keep that in mind. Any percentages are based off of page numbers, not word count. First off, I want to show you guys Pride and Prejudice. I broke this down. At the beginning, Mr. Darcy is obviously introduced. This happens very early on, 3% of the way through the novel. But then we move into the story of Mr. Darcy and Elizabeth's romance, which is, of course, the plot of Pride and Prejudice. So at the 23% mark, Elizabeth and Darcy dance for the first time at the Netherfield Ball. This is pretty commonly regarded as the moment when they start to fall in love, or when he starts to fall for her, rather. She doesn't really like him at this point. I love this book so much. So at the 50% mark, 48%, Mr. Darcy professes his love to Elizabeth. This is like the proposal scene, and she just rejects him resoundingly. There has to be a halfway point where everything kind of shifts and the main character's mentality changes, and this is it. You know, the moment that Mr. Darcy professes his love and Elizabeth rejects it, their entire relationship changes. At the 81% mark, that's when Elizabeth discovers that Mr. Darcy intervened on behalf of Lydia and Wickham. This is pretty impacting because this is the moment that she realizes that she was wrong. And then we go into the very end of the novel. At the 94% mark, once again about 5% left in the book, Elizabeth professes her love to Darcy and they decide to be together. Now that wraps up Pride and Prejudice pretty well. I love this book. I think that Jane Austen really knew what she was doing when she crafted a story. She had a lot of intrigue, she had a lot of subplots, but I think that this is a really good way to kind of break down the very basics of the story. If you were going to start writing this, you would know roughly what parts you'd need to hit in order to make my 5-sentence plotting method work. Next up, I went ahead and broke down Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone. Okay, so Harry Potter is a bit different. It follows roughly the same kind of story structure, but there's a lot going on with Harry and his friends and Harry and school that it was kind of hard for me to pin down what the main story was, but I went ahead and went with the Quest for the Sorcerer's Stone, which is the title of the book. So Harry Potter fans, feel free to disagree with me here, but this is kind of what I decided were the major plot issues that happened here. So of course we start out with Harry becoming a wizard. That happens at the 16% mark. Harry boards the Hogwarts Express at the 30% mark. Harry gets the news of the Gringotts break-in, which just brings it back to the Sorcerer's Stone at the 45% mark, and then he decides to retrieve the Sorcerer's Stone before Snape at the 87% mark. And then of course it ends with him defeating Voldemort with about 5% left of the novel. Again, this is just kind of my personal take on this. I know that there's a lot going on in this book. It was kind of hard for me to pick what the most important parts are. I went back and forth about the 50% mark between this and him becoming friends with Hermione in the troll scene in the dungeon, just because I think that that's a really big character moment. So keep that in mind when you're plotting your book. It really could just be a big character moment instead of a plot relevant moment. It really just kind of depends on what type of story you're trying to tell. Next, I went ahead and broke down Percy Jackson. Okay, Percy Jackson. So this one was a little bit tricky too, just because I think that there are two stories going side by side. Again, it's the physical story of Percy trying to locate the Master Bolt, and it's the emotional story of Percy understanding where his heritage is coming from and who his father is, and learning to be accepted by that. I said that Percy Jackson arrives at Camp Half-Blood at the 15% mark, 14% mark. Percy is given his first quest at the 34% mark, which just kind of kicks off that three-act structure where he leaves home. He calls upon his father for help at the 54% mark, which again, I just think is a very impacting character moment for him. But this kind of went back and forth. It could have been the scene with Ares where he interacts with the god. It could have been the scene with Medusa where he finally defeats his first, real monster. It just kind of depends. But he finds the bolt at the 80% mark, and then he discovers that Luke is the traitor who kind of set him up for failure at the 93% mark. And again, at that point, there's just nowhere to go but, to the conclusion. So I think that this is a really good way to kind of show that there are two simultaneous quests going side by side. Again, it kind of goes along par with Harry Potter. I think that's just kind of a trait in middle grade, especially about discovering who you are. So those two books show that example very well. And finally, I broke down The Hunger Games. Now this one's a little different and I'm going to explain it as we go along. So, okay, we all know that The Hunger Games is part one of a trilogy. And I think that Suzanne Collins kind of designed the first book to kick off that trilogy. Now, I am going to have a word of caution about that. For a debut author, it's a pretty risky thing to do to structure a book based on the idea that it's going to be a trilogy because you don't know if anyone's going to purchase that book. And by deciding to structure everything in that first standalone novel as if it were a trilogy, you're kind of setting yourself up for failure and for the book to be shelved if it doesn't sell. So just keep that in mind. I think that I'm going to do a whole new video about that, I think, but just be wary when you're about to go into a trilogy because there's just no guarantees in this business that it's ever going to sell. But for The Hunger Games, number one, I said that Katniss volunteers for The Hunger Games. That happens at the 6% mark. She arrives at the Capitol at the 15% mark. The Hunger Games doesn't begin until the 40% mark, and then she doesn't take the offensive until the 76% mark. So the reason that I say this is different than normal is because, normally at the 50% mark, that's when the main character has a shift in mentality and starts to take control of a situation that was otherwise spiraling. Again, that really should happen at the 50% mark in a normal plotting structure. But because this is a trilogy, Suzanne Collins structured it so that you had a lot of front loading about how terrible the Capitol is. And this was necessary in this book because if you didn't understand how awful the Capitol was, the other two books in the war against the Capitol wouldn't really make sense. But again, she's kind of the exception to the rule. You can't really expect that your first book will sell, even if it's a trilogy or if it's not a trilogy. You operating on that assumption is kind of setting you up for failure. I think that this is a really interesting case study, just because it's not quite as typical as you would expect the structuring of this novel to go. So anyway, I want to stress that just because this is how I plot my books, this doesn't mean that it's the end-all be-all method of plotting. It doesn't mean that it's going to work in every situation all the time. I mean, I showed a couple examples that backed up what I did, but then The Hunger Games just kind of threw everything that I said out of the water, and that was a wildly successful book. So I recommend that you look into different plotting structures. I'm going to go through a couple of my writing reference books next week, and I recommend you read some of those. I mean, there's some really great options for trying, and no one method is going to work for everybody. This just helps me by breaking down into the 5 sentences. It helps me understand how my plot structure is going to go in a not so intimidating plotting way. So hopefully this helps. I would really love it if you'd hit the subscribe button and the bell icon down below. And if you have any comments or questions, just let me know. I'm always available on Twitter and I'd love to talk to you guys on YouTube. So please let me know, and I hope you guys have a wonderful afternoon. See you next week.